Sarah Martinez pulled her sleeves down as she entered the crowded coffee shop near the military base. The familiar weight of stares followed her wherever she went these days. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the whispers and sideways glances that came with being a woman, covered in intricate tattoos. But it never got easier. The morning rush was in full swing, and the small cafe buzzed with conversation. Military personnel in their crisp uniforms mixed with civilians grabbing their daily caffeine fix before work. Sarah took her place in line, keeping her eyes focused ahead while trying to ignore the growing murmur of voices behind her. "Look at that one," she heard someone whisper, covered in all that ink like some kind of street thug. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained still. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. The tattoos that decorated her arms, shoulders, and neck weren't random designs chosen on a whim. Each one told a story, carried meaning, and represented a piece of her journey that most people would never understand. The line moved slowly, and Sarah found herself trapped between a group of young soldiers who seemed to find her appearance particularly amusing. One of them, a cocky private with barely any stripes on his sleeve, nudged his friend and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Bet she's got daddy issues," he snorted. "Probably never had a real man in her life. That's why she's trying so hard to look tough." His companions laughed, emboldened by their leader's crude commentary. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. These boys had no idea what they were talking about, no understanding of what her tattoos actually represented. "I heard girls like that are easy," another soldier chimed in. "All that rebellion is just crying out for attention, probably desperate for any guy to notice her." The comments grew louder and more obnoxious as the group fed off each other's energy. Other customers began to notice the commotion, some shaking their heads in disapproval at Sarah rather than at the soldiers making the crude remarks. In their eyes, she was the problem, the one who had invited this attention by choosing to mark her body in such a visible way. Sarah finally reached the counter, grateful for the momentary reprieve from the commentary behind her. The young barista, barely out of high school, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "What can I get you?" the girl asked, her tone notably cooler than it had been with previous customers. "Large black coffee, please," Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. As she waited for her order, the soldiers continued their commentary, now speculating about what other tattoos she might have hidden beneath her clothes. Their words grew increasingly inappropriate, and Sarah could feel the stares of other customers burning into her back. "Probably got them in prison," one soldier suggested with a laugh. "Or maybe she's in some kind of gang. You never know with people like that." The barista handed Sarah her coffee with obvious reluctance, as if she might catch something contagious from brief contact. Sarah reached for her wallet, her sleeve riding up slightly to reveal more of the detailed artwork on her forearm. The reaction was immediate and predictable. "Did you see that one?" A woman at a nearby table gasped to her companion. "It looks so aggressive. Why would anyone do that to themselves?" Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she counted out exact change. Desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and assumption, she had dealt with this kind of treatment for years, but it never stopped hurting. People saw the ink on her skin and immediately decided who she was, what she represented, and what she was worth. The soldiers behind her had grown bolder, their comments now directed toward her rather than about her. "Hey, tattoo lady," one called out. "Where'd you get all that work done? Looks like you went to someone with shaky hands." Sarah turned slightly, and for the first time the soldiers got a clear look at one of the larger pieces on her neck. It was a beautifully detailed eagle with spread wings, rendered in black and gray with incredible precision. Below it, partially visible above her collar, were what appeared to be military insignia. "What's that supposed to be?" the private asked mockingly. "Playing dress-up soldier now? Stolen valor much?" The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Stolen valor was a serious charge in military communities, implying that someone was falsely claiming military service or honors they hadn't earned. The coffee shop fell silent as the weight of the accusation hung in the air. Sarah felt every eye in the place focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to such a serious allegation. Her hands shook as she gripped her coffee cup, the heat from the liquid barely registering through her overwhelming emotional response. The young private stepped closer, emboldened by the attention he was receiving from his peers and the apparent validation from other customers who were nodding in agreement. In their minds, it all made sense now. Here was some troubled young woman who had not only defaced her body with inappropriate tattoos but was now dishonoring military service by wearing symbols she had no right to display. "You should be ashamed of yourself," an older man called out from across the cafe. "My son served 3 tours in Afghanistan. People like you make me sick pretending to be something you're not." Sarah wanted to respond, wanted to explain, wanted to defend herself against the growing tide of hostility and misunderstanding, but the words wouldn't come. She stood frozen in the center of the coffee shop, surrounded by people who had already tried and convicted her based on nothing more than their assumptions and prejudices. The private sensed victory and pressed his advantage. "Come on, fake soldier girl. Where'd you serve? What unit? What's your MOS?" He rattled off military terminology with the confidence of someone certain he was exposing a fraud. Sarah's silence only seemed to confirm their suspicions. The crowd's mood grew uglier, with several people openly expressing their disgust at what they perceived as her deception and disrespect. She clutched her coffee tighter, fighting back tears that threatened to betray the emotional toll this public humiliation was taking on her. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, the cafe door opened with such force that it slammed against the wall, causing everyone to turn toward the sudden interruption. The figure that entered commanded immediate attention without saying a word. Commander James Iron Patterson stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene before him. His dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal placed with military precision. The Navy SEAL trident gleamed on his chest, and his weathered face bore the kind of authority that only came from years of leading men and women in the world's most dangerous places. The coffee shop fell silent as everyone recognized the presence of a high-ranking military officer. The young soldiers who had been so bold moments before suddenly found their voices caught in their throats. Commander Patterson's steel-gray eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every expression, before settling on Sarah, who stood frozen in the center of the hostile crowd. "What seems to be the problem here?" Patterson's voice carried the kind of calm authority that made everyone want to stand at attention. His tone was measured, but there was an underlying edge that suggested he was not someone to be trifled with. The private who had been leading the verbal assault against Sarah stepped forward, clearly eager to explain the situation to what he assumed would be a sympathetic superior officer. "Sir, we caught this woman wearing military insignia. She's got tattoos that look like stolen valor, sir. We were just trying to call her out on it." Patterson nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he processed this information. "I see. And you determined this how exactly?" "Well, sir, just look at her," the private continued, his confidence growing as he assumed he had the commander's support. "All those tattoos, the way she's dressed. She doesn't look like any soldier I've ever seen, and when we asked her about her service, she couldn't answer basic questions." "Couldn't answer or wouldn't answer?" Patterson asked quietly, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. The private faltered slightly at the distinction but pressed on. "Does it matter, sir? People like her shouldn't be allowed to pretend they served when real heroes are dying overseas." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Many of the civilians nodded their heads, clearly supporting the young soldier's position. In their minds, this was exactly the kind of justice they wanted to see. Military personnel standing up to those who would dishonor their service. Patterson took a step closer to Sarah, his boots clicking on the tile floor with military precision. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, though they had never met before. "Ma'am," Patterson said formally, "would you mind showing me those tattoos these gentlemen are so concerned about?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then slowly began rolling up her sleeves. The intricate artwork revealed itself inch by inch, each design more detailed and meaningful than the last. But it was when she loosened her scarf and revealed the piece on her neck that Patterson's expression began to change. The eagle was magnificent, rendered with the kind of skill that spoke of expensive, professional work. But more importantly, Patterson could now see the details that the soldiers had missed in their rush to judgment. Below the eagle, partially hidden by Sarah's collar, were not random military symbols but specific unit insignia. And there, small but clearly visible to someone who knew what to look for, were the dates and coordinates that told a very different story than the one the crowd had assumed. "These tattoos," Patterson said slowly, his voice carrying across the silent coffee shop, Tell me about them. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. They're memorial pieces, sir. Each one represents someone who didn't make it home. The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly as people began to realize they might have misunderstood the situation. Patterson nodded for her to continue. The eagle represents my brother Marcus. Sarah continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. He was killed by an IED in Fallujah in 2007. The coordinates underneath marked the exact location where he died. She pointed to another tattoo on her forearm. A detailed compass rose surrounded by names. These are the members of his unit who were killed in the same attack. 12 men who never came home to their families. Patterson's expression had grown increasingly solemn as Sarah explained each piece of artwork adorning her skin. The young soldiers who had been so quick to accuse her of stolen valor were beginning to look uncomfortable, sensing that they had made a terrible mistake. This one, Sarah said, indicating a complex piece that wrapped around her shoulder, represents my cousin Jamie. She was a medic who died saving wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. She was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for her actions that day. The silence in the coffee shop was now oppressive, broken only by the sound of Sarah's voice as she continued to explain the significance of her tattoos. Each piece of artwork represented a life lost, a family destroyed, a future that would never be realized. The piece on my back, she continued, though she didn't expose it in the crowded cafe, lists the names of 47 service members from my hometown who have been killed in action since 2001. I add new names whenever someone doesn't come home. Patterson stood perfectly still, his military bearing unchanged, but those close enough could see the emotion flickering in his eyes. As a SEAL commander, he had lost many brothers and sisters in arms over the years. He understood the weight of that loss, the burden of carrying those memories. And this one? He asked, gesturing to a small tattoo on her wrist that most people had overlooked. Sarah's voice broke slightly as she answered. That's for my fiancé, David. He was a Marine. We were supposed to be married when he got back from his 3rd deployment to Iraq. Instead, I got a folded flag and a letter he wrote but never got to send. The young private who had started this confrontation was now visibly pale, realizing the magnitude of his error. The other soldiers in his group were staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The civilians who had been so quick to judge Sarah based on her appearance were beginning to understand that they had completely misread the situation. Patterson cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. So let me understand this correctly, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. You gentlemen saw a young woman honoring fallen service members with memorial tattoos, and your first instinct was to accuse her of stolen valor. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. The soldiers shuffled uncomfortably, knowing they had no adequate response to their commander's question. Furthermore, Patterson continued, rather than show respect for someone grieving lost loved ones, you chose to mock and harass her in public? The crowd that had been so unified in their condemnation of Sarah just minutes before was now fragmenting, with many people looking ashamed of their participation in her humiliation. Commander Patterson stepped back and looked directly at Sarah, his military bearing shifting into something even more formal and respectful. The entire coffee shop watched in stunned silence as this decorated Navy SEAL officer slowly raised his right hand to his brow in a perfect military salute. Ma'am, he said with unmistakable reverence, it is my honor to salute someone who carries the memory of our fallen heroes with such dedication and respect. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. This was not just any salute. This was the kind of recognition typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients or during the most solemn military ceremonies. Patterson held the salute for a full 10 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand the gravity and sincerity of his action. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to process what was happening. For years, she had endured ridicule, judgment, and hostility because of her tattoos. Now, for the first time, someone in authority was publicly acknowledging the true meaning behind her body art. Thank you, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. Patterson lowered his salute and turned to address the young soldiers who had initiated the confrontation. His expression had hardened considerably, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his command authority. Private Thompson, he said, having somehow identified the ringleader by name despite never having met him before. Step forward. The young soldier approached with obvious reluctance, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He stood at attention, but his hands were trembling slightly as he awaited what he knew would be severe consequences for his actions. In my 25 years of military service, Patterson began, his voice deadly calm, I have seen many examples of poor judgment, lack of discipline, and failure to uphold military values. But rarely have I witnessed such a complete failure to understand what we actually stand for. The private's face had gone completely white. Around him, his fellow soldiers looked equally terrified, realizing that their careers might be in serious jeopardy. This young woman, Patterson continued, gesturing toward Sarah, has shown more respect for our fallen brothers and sisters than any of you demonstrated today. While you were busy making assumptions and hurling accusations, she was quietly honoring the memory of heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice. The commander's voice grew louder, carrying clearly to every corner of the cafe. The fact that you could look at memorial tattoos dedicated to fallen service members and see stolen valor tells me everything I need to know about your character and your understanding of military values. Several civilians in the crowd began to look ashamed of their own participation in Sarah's humiliation. They had been so quick to join in the condemnation without bothering to learn the facts or consider alternative explanations for what they were seeing. Patterson wasn't finished. Private Thompson, you will report to my office at 600 tomorrow morning. You and your entire group will be writing formal letters of apology to this young woman. And you will be completing a comprehensive educational program on military sacrifice and the meaning of honor. The private nodded mutely, understanding that he was receiving a punishment that was both merciful and severe. Patterson could have ended his military career with a single phone call, but instead was offering him a chance to learn and grow from his mistake. Furthermore, Patterson continued, you will all be volunteering at the local Veterans Affairs office for the next 6 months, where you will have the opportunity to meet real heroes and learn what actual service looks like. Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that someone would not only defend her, but also ensure that her tormentors faced real consequences for their actions. The commander then turned his attention to the broader crowd. As for the rest of you, he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled civilians, I hope today has taught you something about the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. An elderly woman who had earlier expressed disgust at Sarah's tattoos now approached hesitantly. Ma'am, she said to Sarah, I owe you a sincere apology. I said terrible things about you without knowing anything about your story. I'm ashamed of my behavior. Her words seemed to break a dam of emotion in the room. One by one, other customers began approaching Sarah to offer their own apologies. The barista who had served her with such obvious reluctance now looked mortified by her earlier attitude. I'm so sorry, the young girl said, tears in her eyes. I had no idea. Your coffee is on the house today, and I'd like to learn more about the people you're honoring, if you're willing to tell me. Sarah nodded graciously, still overwhelmed by the dramatic turn of events. Their stories deserve to be told, she said quietly. They were all heroes in their own way. Commander Patterson watched these interactions with satisfaction, seeing that his intervention had accomplished more than just stopping a bullying incident. He had created a teaching moment that would likely stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. Ma'am, he said to Sarah, I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment. Sarah nodded, and they stepped outside the cafe into the morning air. The spring sunshine seemed brighter somehow, as if the world had shifted on its axis in the span of a few minutes. I want you to know, Patterson said once they were alone, that what you're doing, keeping their memory alive, it matters more than you probably realize. Too often our fallen heroes become just statistics, names on a wall, but you've made them real, made them present in your daily life. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It doesn't feel like enough sometimes, she admitted. David used to say that the worst thing that could happen to a fallen soldier wasn't dying. It was being forgotten. Patterson nodded, understanding. He was a wise man, and based on what I've seen today, he chose well when he chose you. The comment brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes, but these were different. Tears of healing rather than pain. For so long she had felt isolated and misunderstood. Now, for the first time in years, she felt truly seen and appreciated for who she really was. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "why did you help me in there? You could have just walked away." Patterson was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because recognizing and honoring sacrifice is what we're supposed to do. It's what separates us from those who only pretend to understand the cost of freedom." As word of the incident spread throughout the military community, Sarah found her life changing in ways she never could have anticipated. The story of the Navy SEAL commander who saluted a woman honoring fallen heroes reached far beyond the small coffee shop where it had occurred. Within days, Sarah began receiving messages from military families across the country. Gold Star mothers reached out to thank her for keeping their children's memories alive. Veterans who had lost brothers and sisters in combat expressed their gratitude for her dedication to honoring the fallen. Each message reinforced what Commander Patterson had told her, that her tribute mattered more than she had ever realized. The local newspaper picked up the story, and soon Sarah found herself being interviewed by reporters who wanted to understand the meaning behind her memorial tattoos. She was initially hesitant to speak publicly, worried that the attention might somehow diminish the solemnity of her tribute. But as she began sharing the stories of the fallen heroes represented on her skin, she realized that their families wanted their loved ones' stories told. "My brother Marcus was only 22 when he died," Sarah explained to a reporter from the city paper. "He had just gotten engaged to his high school sweetheart. He wanted to be a teacher when he got out of the military. Now she teaches in his memory, and every year her students learn about the sacrifice he made." The article about Sarah and her memorial tattoos was picked up by larger news outlets, and soon her story was being shared nationwide. Veterans organizations began inviting her to speak at events, recognizing that her unique approach to honoring fallen service members resonated with people in a way that traditional memorials sometimes couldn't. Commander Patterson had been transferred to a new assignment, but before leaving, he made sure to connect Sarah with local veterans groups and military support organizations. He understood that her passion for honoring the fallen could be channeled into something even more meaningful than her personal memorial. Sarah began volunteering at the local VA hospital, where she met countless veterans dealing with survivor's guilt, PTSD, and the complex emotions that came with losing friends in combat. Many of them were amazed by her dedication to preserving the memory of people she had never served alongside. "You carry them with you every day," observed Maria Santos, a female veteran who had lost her best friend in a roadside bombing in Iraq. "That's something most people can't understand, but you do it anyway." Through her volunteer work, Sarah learned about other ways people honored fallen service members. She met a man who had named his business after his deceased squad leader, a woman who had established a scholarship fund in her son's memory, and a couple who had started a nonprofit providing support to military families. Inspired by these examples, Sarah began developing her own project. Working with a local tattoo artist who specialized in memorial work, she started offering free memorial tattoos to military families who couldn't otherwise afford them. The project grew quickly as word spread through the veteran community. "Every tattoo tells a story," Sarah explained to families who came to honor their lost loved ones. "Your story is just as important as mine, and your hero deserves to be remembered just as much as any of the people I carry with me." The Memorial Tattoo Project attracted attention from corporate sponsors who wanted to support military families. Soon, Sarah was running a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families create lasting tributes to their fallen heroes. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same tattoos that had once made her a target for ridicule had become the foundation for helping others heal and remember. One particularly meaningful moment came when Mrs. Patterson, the mother of a young Marine killed in Afghanistan, came in for a memorial tattoo. "I was so angry when my son first talked about getting tattoos," she admitted to Sarah. "I thought they were just for troublemakers and rebels. Now I understand that they can be about love and memory and keeping someone close to your heart." The tattoo Mrs. Patterson chose was simple but powerful. Her son's name surrounded by the emblem of the Marine Corps, placed over her heart. As the artist worked, she told Sarah stories about her boy, sharing memories that brought both tears and laughter. "He would have loved this," she said, looking at the finished work. "He always said that the most important thing was to be remembered, not for how you died, but for how you lived." Sarah's nonprofit continued to grow, attracting volunteers who had been touched by loss and wanted to help others navigate their grief. Many of the volunteers were veterans themselves, people who understood the unique bond between service members and the devastating impact of losing someone in that brotherhood. The organization began hosting memorial events where families could share stories about their lost loved ones. These gatherings became powerful healing experiences, bringing together people who might otherwise have grieved alone. Sarah often spoke at these events, sharing her own journey from isolation and judgment to understanding and acceptance. For years, I felt like I was carrying this burden alone, she would tell audiences. I thought the world saw me as some kind of freak because of my tattoos. But when Commander Patterson saluted me that day, he wasn't just recognizing my tribute. He was recognizing the sacrifice of every person whose memory I carry. The story of that day in the coffee shop had become legendary in military circles, often shared as an example of true leadership and the importance of understanding before judging. Commander Patterson himself had been recognized by his superiors for his handling of the situation, though he always deflected credit back to Sarah and the fallen heroes she honored. Sarah received a letter from Patterson several months after their first meeting. In it, he shared that the young soldiers who had harassed her had become some of the most dedicated volunteers at their local VA hospital. Their punishment had turned into a genuine awakening about the cost of military service and the importance of honoring those who had paid the ultimate price. Private Thompson asked me to pass along his gratitude, Patterson wrote. He said that day changed his understanding of what it means to serve and what it means to honor those who have served before us. He's planning to get his own memorial tattoo for a buddy he lost in training. With your organization's help, if you're willing. The transformation of her tormentors into allies felt like a completion of some cosmic circle to Sarah. The same young men who had once mocked her dedication were now contributing to her mission of honoring fallen heroes. It was proof that even the most painful experiences could lead to positive change when handled with grace and understanding. 2 years after the incident in the coffee shop, Sarah's memorial tattoo nonprofit had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. What had started as a personal mission to honor fallen heroes had evolved into a nationwide organization with chapters in 12 states and partnerships with major veterans organizations. The annual Memorial Day gathering that Sarah's organization hosted had become one of the largest veteran events in the region. Families traveled from hundreds of miles away to participate in the ceremony, where stories were shared, tears were shed, and memories were celebrated. This year's event was particularly special because Commander Patterson, now Admiral Patterson, had agreed to be the keynote speaker. Sarah stood at the edge of the memorial garden that her organization had established at the local veterans cemetery. Each tree planted there represented a fallen service member, whose family had been helped by their memorial tattoo program. Plaques at the base of each tree told abbreviated versions of their stories, ensuring that visitors would understand the human cost of military service. Nervous about today? Asked Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's assistant director, and the widow of an Army Ranger killed in Syria. Jennifer had joined the organization after receiving her own memorial tattoo, and her business background had been instrumental in helping them expand their reach. Always, Sarah admitted, watching as families began arriving for the ceremony. But it's a good nervous. These families deserve to have their heroes celebrated, and I want to make sure we do them justice. The crowd that gathered was unlike any Sarah had seen at previous events. Military families mixed with active duty personnel, veterans from multiple generations, and civilians who had been touched by the organization's work. Local media was present, but they maintained a respectful distance, understanding that this was about remembrance rather than publicity. As Admiral Patterson took the stage, Sarah was struck by how much his presence still commanded respect and attention. He had been promoted twice since their first meeting, but he remained the same man who had seen past appearances to recognize the truth of her mission. 2 years ago, Patterson began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. I witnessed something that changed my understanding of how we honor our fallen. A young woman named Sarah Martinez was being mocked and harassed for carrying memorial tattoos dedicated to heroes she had never served alongside but refused to forget. The audience listened intently as Patterson retold the story of that day in the coffee shop. Many of them had heard versions of it before, but hearing it from the Admiral himself gave it additional weight and meaning. What I saw that day wasn't just someone defending herself against unfair treatment, Patterson continued. I saw the embodiment of the military values we claim to uphold: loyalty, honor, respect, and selfless service. Sarah was demonstrating all of these things, not in uniform, not in an official capacity, but as a civilian who understood what military service really means. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as the Admiral spoke about her work and its impact on military families. She had never sought recognition for herself, only wanting to ensure that fallen heroes were remembered and honored appropriately. The organization that grew from that confrontation has now helped over 2,000 families create lasting memorials to their loved ones, Patterson announced. But more importantly, it has created a community where grief can be shared, stories can be told, and healing can begin. Following the Admiral's speech, the ceremony transitioned into the memorial portion of the event. One by one, families were invited to share brief stories about their fallen heroes. Each story was unique, but they all shared common themes of love, sacrifice, and the desire to serve something greater than themselves. Maria Rodriguez told the crowd about her son Carlos, a Marine who had dreamed of becoming a doctor, but had enlisted after 9/11 to serve his country first. He said the medical school would still be there when he got back, she said through tears. He never got the chance to save lives as a doctor, but he saved his squad when he threw himself on a grenade in Helmand Province. James Butler spoke about his daughter Amanda, one of the first female Rangers to be killed in combat. She faced discrimination and doubt throughout her military career, he said proudly. But she proved that courage and determination aren't limited by gender. She died leading from the front just like she lived. Each story reinforced the same truth that Sarah had learned through her own journey: that behind every statistic, every casualty report, every folded flag was a unique individual with dreams, hopes, and people who loved them. The memorial tattoos that her organization helped create weren't just artwork. They were declarations that these lives had mattered and would not be forgotten. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began gathering in smaller groups throughout the memorial garden. Sarah moved among them, listening to conversations, offering comfort where needed and sharing in the collective remembrance that had brought them all together. She was approached by a young woman named Lisa Chen, whose brother had been killed in a training accident just 3 months earlier. "I've been thinking about getting a memorial tattoo," Lisa said hesitantly, "but I'm scared about what people will think. My family is pretty traditional, and they don't understand why I would want to mark my body permanently." Sarah took Lisa's hands in hers, remembering her own fears and uncertainties from years past. "The only opinion that matters is yours and your brother's," she said gently. "If carrying his memory on your skin will help you heal and honor him, then that's what you should do. The rest of the world will have to adjust their opinions to match the truth." This conversation, repeated dozens of times throughout the day with different families facing similar decisions, reminded Sarah why her work remained so important. Despite all the progress they had made in changing public perception of memorial tattoos, there were still people who faced judgment and misunderstanding when they chose to honor their loved ones in this way. As the sun began to set, Admiral Patterson found Sarah sitting quietly by herself near the memorial garden's central fountain. The feature had been designed to include an eternal flame that burned continuously in honor of all fallen service members. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since that day in the coffee shop," Sarah replied. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, and sometimes it feels like yesterday." Patterson nodded, understanding. The best leaders often don't realize they're leading until they look back and see who was following them. You've created something beautiful here, something that honors not just the fallen but the love their families carry for them. I couldn't have done any of this without that moment when you chose to see the truth instead of accepting assumptions, Sarah said. "You changed everything when you saluted me that day." "No," Patterson corrected gently. "I simply recognized what was already there. You were already honoring heroes, already carrying their memory, already demonstrating the values we claim to serve. I just made sure other people could see it too." 3 years had passed since that transformative day in the coffee shop, and Sarah's life had taken directions she never could have imagined. The Memorial Tattoo Organization had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive support network for military families that included counseling services, educational programs, and advocacy work for veterans' rights. Sarah found herself traveling frequently now, speaking at military bases, veterans events, and conferences about grief and remembrance. Her message had expanded beyond just memorial tattoos to encompass a broader understanding of how society treats military families and the importance of supporting those who sacrifice for their country. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for what would be one of her most challenging speaking engagements yet. She had been invited to address a group of military academy cadets, future officers who would one day lead soldiers into combat and potentially face the devastating reality of losing people under their command. Standing before the mirror in her hotel room, Sarah carefully selected which tattoos to reveal during her presentation. Each piece of memorial artwork told a story that these young cadets needed to hear. But she had learned over the years that the visual impact needed to be balanced with the emotional weight of the message. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Patterson, who had remained a mentor and friend throughout her journey. "Knock them dead today, but not literally. We need more officers who understand what real leadership looks like." Sarah smiled at his message, remembering how his intervention had changed not just her life, but the lives of countless military families. She had received word just last week that Private Thompson, the soldier who had initially harassed her, was now completing officer training and had requested to volunteer with their organization during his leave time. The military academy's auditorium was packed, with nearly 400 cadets when Sarah took the stage. Looking out at their young, eager faces, she was struck by how similar they looked to her brother Marcus when he had first enlisted. Most of these cadets were barely older than Marcus had been when he died, yet they had already committed themselves to a life of service that could end in ultimate sacrifice. "Good morning. Future leaders," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of what she was about to share. "I'm here today to talk to you about leadership, but not the kind you'll find in your textbooks or training manuals. I want to talk to you about the leadership that happens after the battle, when the smoke clears and you're left counting who didn't make it home." The auditorium fell silent as Sarah began removing her jacket and rolling up her sleeves, revealing the intricate memorial tattoos that covered her arms. She had learned that visual impact was crucial when speaking to military audiences. They needed to see the reality of loss, not just hear about it. "Every tattoo you see on my body represents a life lost in service to our country," she continued, turning slowly so the cadets could see the full scope of her memorial artwork. "I never served alongside these heroes, but I carry them with me every day because someone needs to remember their stories." She began with Marcus, her brother, explaining how a young man with dreams of becoming a teacher had died protecting his squad from an IED attack. As she spoke about each fallen hero represented on her skin, Sarah could see the impact her words were having on the cadets. Many of them were realizing for the first time that the abstract concept of military sacrifice had very real, very personal dimensions. "Some of you will become platoon leaders, company commanders, battalion leaders," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her message. "And some of you, statistically speaking, will lose people under your command. When that happens, how you choose to honor their memory will define not just your leadership but your character." A cadet in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you deal with carrying all that loss? Doesn't it get overwhelming?" Sarah nodded, appreciating the honest question. "It absolutely can be overwhelming. There are days when the weight of all these stories feels too heavy to carry. But then I remember that the alternative is letting these heroes be forgotten, and that's not acceptable." She went on to explain how her memorial tattoos had initially made her a target for ridicule and judgment, how people had assumed the worst about her character based solely on her appearance. The cadets listened intently as she described the incident in the coffee shop and Admiral Patterson's intervention. "The lesson here isn't about tattoos," Sarah emphasized. "It's about leadership, judgment, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." Admiral Patterson could have walked away that day. He could have avoided getting involved in what appeared to be a minor confrontation. Instead, he chose to look deeper, to understand before judging, and to defend someone who was honoring the very values he had sworn to uphold. A male cadet near the back of the auditorium spoke up. "Ma'am, what would you want us to do differently if we encounter a situation like that?" "Ask questions before making assumptions," Sarah replied immediately. "Take time to understand what you're seeing before deciding how to respond. And remember that leadership isn't just about commanding troops in battle. It's about standing up for what's right in everyday situations, even when it's uncomfortable. She shared stories from her organization's work, explaining how they had helped families across the country create meaningful memorials for their lost loved ones. She told them about Gold Star mothers who had found healing through memorial tattoos, about veterans who had overcome survivors' guilt by honoring fallen comrades, and about children who had grown up carrying their parents' memory in permanent form. Your job as future officers will be to lead people who are willing to die for their country, Sarah said as her presentation neared its conclusion. But it will also be to ensure that if they do make that sacrifice, their deaths have meaning and their lives are remembered. During the question and answer period that followed, Sarah was impressed by the thoughtfulness and maturity of the cadets' inquiries. They asked about supporting military families, about dealing with survivors' guilt, and about ways to honor fallen service members beyond traditional memorials. One particularly poignant question came from a cadet whose father had been killed in Iraq when she was 12 years old. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about getting a memorial tattoo for my dad, but I'm worried about how it might affect my military career. What would you advise?" Sarah's heart went out to the young woman, remembering her own struggles with judgment and acceptance. "The military is slowly changing its policies about tattoos, especially memorial ones," she said. "But more importantly, you need to do what feels right for honoring your father's memory. If a memorial tattoo would help you carry his legacy forward, then that's what matters most." 5 years after the incident that changed her life, Sarah stood once again in the same coffee shop where her journey had begun. The space looked almost identical, but everything else had transformed beyond recognition. She was no longer the isolated, misunderstood woman who had endured public humiliation here. Today, she was a respected advocate, author, and leader in the military family support community. The occasion for her return was bittersweet. The coffee shop was hosting a memorial event for David Chen, a local Marine who had been killed in a training accident overseas. His sister Lisa, whom Sarah had met at the Memorial Garden event years earlier, had organized the gathering as part of her own healing journey. Sarah watched as military families, veterans, and community members filled the small space that had once felt so hostile to her. The walls now displayed a rotating exhibit of memorial art, created by families who had lost loved ones in military service. The owner, who had witnessed the original confrontation, had become one of the strongest supporters of Sarah's organization. "I can't believe this is the same place where it all started," said Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's longtime assistant director, as she surveyed the transformed space. "It's like something out of a movie." "Life has a strange way of bringing things full circle," Sarah replied, thinking about all the paths that had led from that terrible morning to this moment of community and remembrance. The event began with Lisa Chen sharing stories about her brother David, the Marine whose memory they had gathered to honor. As she spoke about his dreams, his service, and his sacrifice, Sarah was reminded of why her work remained so vital. Each fallen service member represented a unique story, a family forever changed, and a legacy that deserved to be preserved. Admiral Patterson, now in civilian clothes following his recent retirement, served as the event's keynote speaker. His presence drew respectful attention from the military personnel in attendance, but Sarah noticed how naturally he blended with the assembled families. Leadership, she had learned, wasn't about rank or uniform. It was about character and the willingness to serve others. 5 years ago, in this very spot, Patterson began, addressing the gathered crowd, I witnessed one of the most powerful examples of true military values I had ever seen. A young woman named Sarah Martinez was being mocked and harassed for the memorial tattoos she carried to honor fallen heroes. What happened next changed not just her life, but the lives of countless military families across our nation. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of emotions that always accompanied retellings of that day. The pain of the original experience had faded, but she could still remember the isolation and humiliation she had felt before Patterson's intervention. Sarah's response to that adversity was to build something beautiful, Patterson continued. Rather than becoming bitter or withdrawing from public engagement, she channeled her pain into purpose. The organization she founded has now helped over 5,000 military families create lasting memorials for their loved ones. The statistics still amaze Sarah. What had begun as a personal mission to honor fallen heroes had grown into a nationwide network of support, remembrance, and healing. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the real impact. The families who had found peace, the veterans who had overcome survivors' guilt, the communities that had learned to better support their military members. As the formal program concluded, Sarah was approached by a familiar face. Private Thompson, now Lieutenant Thompson, stood before her in dress uniform, his bearing confident but respectful. The young soldier who had once mocked her tattoos was now a decorated officer who spent his leave time volunteering with veteran support organizations. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you again for what you taught me about true leadership and honor. That day changed my entire understanding of what it means to serve." Sarah smiled at the transformation she witnessed in the young man. "You chose to learn and grow from that experience, Lieutenant. That took courage and character that was already inside you." Thompson nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "I'm getting married next month, and my fiancée and I have decided to start our marriage by getting memorial tattoos for her brother, who was killed in Afghanistan last year. We were hoping your organization might help us design something appropriate." The request brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The complete transformation from mockery to understanding, from judgment to participation, represented everything she had hoped to achieve through her work. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing outside the coffee shop with Admiral Patterson, looking at the memorial plaque that had been installed near the entrance. The simple bronze marker read, "In honor of all who serve and remember, where judgment gave way to understanding." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked into that coffee shop that day?" Patterson asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But I've learned that the most important moments in life often seem like coincidences, until you look back and see the pattern. You were supposed to be there that day, just like I was supposed to experience what I did." "No regrets then?" Patterson asked. "None," Sarah replied firmly. "Every moment of pain, every instance of judgment, every challenge led to this." She gestured toward the warm light spilling from the coffee shop windows, where families were still sharing stories and finding comfort in community. Their conversation was interrupted by Lisa Chen, who approached with a small wrapped package. "Sarah, I wanted to give you this before everyone leaves tonight." Inside the package was a framed photograph of David Chen in his Marine dress uniform, along with a handwritten letter. "This was the last letter David wrote before he died," Lisa explained. "In it, he talks about hoping that if anything happened to him, someone would make sure his story mattered. You've done that for so many families, and now you're doing it for ours." Sarah read the letter with tears streaming down her face. David's words echoed sentiments she had heard from hundreds of military families. The hope that their sacrifice would have meaning, that their stories would be remembered, that their lives would matter beyond their death. "He would be so proud to know that his story is part of something bigger now," Lisa continued. "The memorial tattoo I got last year isn't just about carrying David with me. It's about connecting with a community that understands loss and chooses to transform it into love." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. The scared, isolated woman who had been publicly humiliated in a coffee shop had become someone who helped others find strength in their darkest moments. The memorial tattoos that had once made her a target for ridicule were now recognized as powerful symbols of love, remembrance, and honor. Her phone buzzed with messages from families across the country who were watching the live stream of the memorial event. Veterans, Gold Star families, and supporters from every branch of military service had tuned in to participate virtually in the ceremony. The community that had grown around her organization transcended geography, bringing together people united by loss but empowered by purpose. The most meaningful message came from Marcus's former fiancée, who had become a teacher just as he had planned to do. "Marcus would be amazed by what you've built in his memory," she wrote. "Every year I tell my students about the hero who wanted to educate children, but chose to serve his country instead. Because of your work, his story lives on in ways he never could have imagined." Sarah pulled into her driveway and sat quietly for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to serve, and new opportunities to honor fallen heroes. But tonight, she was content to simply appreciate how far she had come and how many lives had been touched by a journey that began with judgment but led to understanding, healing, and hope. The memorial tattoos covering her skin seemed to pulse with warmth in the darkness, each one a reminder that love transcends death, that sacrifice has meaning, and that sometimes the most beautiful transformations emerge from the deepest pain. David's words, Marcus's memory, and the stories of countless other heroes would continue to inspire and guide her work, ensuring that no service member's story would ever be forgotten.